Oak Haven, the Midwest. November 24th. A woman sits at a mahogany table, her hand resting on a manila folder that weighs more than a loaded gun. My name is Deliah Pratt, and in exactly 2 minutes, my father is going to announce the end of our family legacy. He thinks he is crowning a king. He doesn't realize he is about to be dethroned. The air smells of roast beef and betrayal. They spent 30 years trying to write me out of the will, trying to make me invisible. But tonight, I am not the daughter who ran away. I am the storm that came back to remind them exactly who I am. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. To understand why my father's announcement felt like a physical blow, you have to understand that I wasn't just ignored. I was actively trained to be invisible. The curriculum started in the cab of a Ford F-150 when I was 7 years old. My grandfather Earl used to take me to job sites, letting me sit on the center console while he explained the rhythm of the business. He taught me that contracts were just promises on paper, but a man's handshake was the real currency. He taught me about equipment margins and how a single overdue invoice could starve 3 families in a bad month. I loved those drives. I vividly remember him tapping the side of my head with a calloused finger one afternoon. "You see patterns the way other folks see colors, kiddo," he told me, his voice gravelly with tobacco and pride. "This place'll need that one day." But Grandpa Earl wasn't the king of the castle. Harold was. And in Harold's kingdom, the laws of physics were different. Girls belonged in the kitchen. Helping mom and boys belonged in the real work. The first time I felt the steel door of that reality slam shut, I was 12. I had asked to sit in on a meeting about purchasing new front-end loaders. I had memorized the specs. I knew which model offered better fuel efficiency. When I walked toward the office, Harold blocked the doorway. He didn't look angry, just bored. "You got no place in those conversations, Dee," he said, ushering Evan, who was busy trying to beat a level on his Game Boy, inside instead. "Don't threaten the professionals by asking dumb questions." That was the preamble. The theft of my identity began in earnest when I was 16. I had spent a weekend building a spreadsheet, a simple thing really, that projected fuel savings if we routed the trucks differently. I was proud of it. I printed it out and left it on Harold's desk, hoping for a good job. Weeks later, I was sweeping the shop floor when I heard a major client clapping Harold on the back. "That fuel route idea," the client said. "Genius, Harry. Evan's got a sharp mind for a kid his age." I froze. Harold laughed loudly, puffing out his chest. "That he does. Natural business mind, that boy." I confronted Harold later in the quiet of the office. I was shaking, tears stinging my eyes. He didn't even look up from his paperwork. He just shrugged, dismissing my rage as if it were a childish tantrum. "We're family, Delia. What's yours is ours. Besides—" He looked at me, then his eyes cold and flat. "Your brother needs the confidence, don't be dramatic." That was the moment the ground shifted. I realized they weren't just ignoring me, they were harvesting me. They were stripping me of my ideas to build a suit of armor for Evan, ensuring he looked like a king while I remained a ghost. When Grandpa Earl died, the last tether snapped. I secretly applied for scholarships in business analytics, desperate to get to Dallas, to a place where math didn't care about your last name. When I got in, Harold refused to pay a cent of tuition. He sneered at me in the driveway as I packed my old sedan. "You'll be back when city life chews you up," he predicted. "You need us." He was wrong. The city didn't chew me up. It sharpened me. I worked 3 jobs, surviving on caffeine and spite, until I landed an internship that turned into a career. I found a mentor, a VP named Marissa Klein, who looked at my spreadsheets and saw the patterns Grandpa Earl had seen. She didn't care about my pedigree. She cared about performance. For the first time, I was visible. Years passed. I built a life on efficiency and hard facts. Then, a few weeks before the dinner, the past came knocking in the worst way possible. I was working on a restructuring portfolio for distressed regional businesses, companies on the brink of death. I opened a digital file marked high risk, and my blood ran cold. There on the screen was Pratt & Sons equipment. I scanned the numbers, my analyst brain overriding my panic. It was a bloodbath. Ballooning debt slashed maintenance budgets, 3 years of delinquent taxes. And there was a note from a partner at a predatory equity firm ideal for acquisition. Strategy asset strip sale. Break apart, sell off land and fleet. The air left my lungs. This wasn't just about me or my ego anymore. If this sale went through, a predatory buyer would gut the company. The workers' men like Frankie, who had fixed my bike, people who had watched me grow up, would lose their pensions, their jobs, everything. I tried to warn them. I called Harold immediately. "Dad, the debt-to-income ratio is fatal," I pleaded. "I see the filings. You're being targeted." He laughed. It was the same dismissive bark from my childhood. "Stop with the spreadsheet fear-mongering, Delia. You don't understand real business. Evan and I have a plan. Stop trying to threaten what we're building." I texted Evan, desperate. "They are going to sell the land out from under you. Please listen." His reply came 2 minutes later. "Calm down, sis. We're leveling up. You'd know if you hadn't run off. Don't embarrass yourself." That night I sat in my tiny Dallas kitchen, the blue light of my laptop illuminating the empty room. It was midnight. I stared at the summary of the distressed file. I realized then that if I didn't act, they would erase the company, the town, and everything Grandpa taught me. And worse, when the dust settled, they would blame me for leaving, for not being there to save them. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and made a choice. I opened a blank spreadsheet. At the top, I typed a header that felt like a declaration of war: Pratt & Sons Paths to Control. The attack began not with a shout, but with a search query. Back in Dallas, fueled by caffeine and a terrifying sense of purpose, I stopped looking at the distressed asset report and started digging into the legal skeleton of Pratt & Sons. My job was finding the weak points in corporate armor, and I found one gaping hole in my father's kingdom. Pulling up the original incorporation documents from the 1970s, I realized that Grandpa Earl had been smarter and kinder than Harold ever gave him credit for. Earl hadn't consolidated ownership solely under the family name. To keep the business anchored in the community, he had distributed non-voting and Class B voting shares to longtime employees and distant relatives. Harold strutted around like an absolute monarch, but legally he was ruling by the silent permission of people he had long ago stopped respecting. He didn't actually own enough stock to block a coordinated hostile takeover. He was vulnerable, and he didn't even know it because he was too arrogant to read the bylaws. I sat back staring at the screen. A wave of nausea hit me. Was I really going to do this? Was I going to stage a coup against my own father? I closed my eyes and imagined the alternative. I saw the for sale signs on the farmhouse, the auctioneers selling off the loaders, the men like Frankie Morales losing their pensions. I remembered Earl's calloused fingers guiding mine over an invoice, teaching me that business was about people. If I took control, I wasn't just stripping my family of power, I was saving what they were willing to sacrifice to feed their egos. The nausea faded, replaced by cold resolve. I took 3 vacation days and drove back to Oakhaven, slipping into town under the radar like a thief. I didn't go to the farm. I went to the people Harold had forgotten. My first stop was Frankie Morales's place. Frankie was a retired mechanic who had kept the fleet running for 30 years. He lived in a small bungalow with peeling paint. When I knocked, he looked at me with suspicion that melted into shock. We sat on his porch and I listened. I didn't pitch him a business deal, I just let him talk. He told me about his wife's sickness and how Harold hadn't visited once, hadn't even sent flowers. "I thought we were family," Frankie whispered, looking at his hands. When I explained that my plan would protect his pension while Harold's path would vaporize it, he didn't hesitate. He signed over his small stake to my LLC. Next was Mrs. Dalton, the widowed former bookkeeper. Her house smelled of lavender and dust. She brought me a slice of pie, her hands shaking slightly. "Harold stopped sending Christmas cards 5 years ago," she said softly. "Your granddaddy wouldn't have done that. Earl knew the birthdays of every child in the county." She signed the papers not for money but for decency. Then there was my cousin, a man Evan had fired for questioning his drinking on the job. He signed out of pure spite, grinning as the ink dried. It was a strange emotional mosaic I was building. These people didn't trust me because I was a Pratt. They trusted me because I was doing the one thing Harold never did. I was listening. Back in Dallas, I cemented the legal armor. I brought in Marissa, my mentor, and a ruthless attorney named Tanya Brooks. We created a shell company, an LLC that felt faceless and corporate to hold the aggregated shares. As Tanya organized the stack of transfer agreements, she paused, giving me a hard look. "Deliah, you need to know something," she said, her voice dropping the lawyerly affect. "Once you do this, there is no going back to normal Thanksgiving dinners. They will say you stripped them of everything. They will paint you as the villain." I looked at the documents, thinking of the crooked photo in the hallway, the way they had edited me out of the narrative for decades. "They already stripped me of my place in this family," I said. "I'm just taking back what they tried to erase." But I wasn't done. The math was close, but I wasn't at a controlling majority yet. I needed the final piece of the puzzle: Ray McConnell. Ray was a co-founder who had left the company 20 years ago after a massive blow-up with Harold. He lived in a cabin 2 hours north, a hermit who had washed his hands of the town's gossip. I drove up the winding gravel road to his place as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the mountains. Ray was waiting on his porch, a shotgun leaning against the railing, looking like a man carved out of granite. He didn't offer me tea. He read the documents in silence, his eyes darting back and forth. Finally, he looked up, piercing me with a stare that felt like it could read my soul. "Are you doing this to destroy your father, girl?" he asked, his voice rough. "Or are you doing it to save the people he forgot?" I was exhausted. I was terrified. I dropped all the corporate polish. "Both," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But saving them matters more. I can live without being his daughter. I can't live watching him erase everyone else." Ray studied me for a long, agonizing minute. He looked at the paper, then back at me. He slowly reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a pen. He uncapped it, the tip hovering just millimeters above the signature line that would seal my father's fate. The wind howled through the trees, the only sound in the world, as I watched the ink point tremble, waiting to see if he would end the war or let it burn. Ray McConnell signed the paper. The ink was still wet when I handed the document to Tanya Brooks in a dimly lit coffee shop 2 towns over. She scanned the pages, her eyes widening behind her glasses, before she looked up at me with a terrifying grin. "That's it," she whispered, tapping the final page. "With Ray's block combined with the employee shares and your own holdings, the LLC now effectively controls 52% of the voting shares. Legally, you are the majority. You can appoint leadership, dissolve the board, and block any sale." She leaned in, her voice low. "If you do this quietly, Harold will spin it. He'll lie. You need to strike when there are witnesses. You need to make it impossible for him to rewrite history." That brought us back to the farmhouse, to the moment the air left the room. I sat at the table, my hand resting on my bag, feeling the weight of the manila folder inside like a loaded weapon. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, filled with the smell of roast beef and the heavy, cloying scent of cheap cologne. Harold was standing at the head of the table, clutching a glass of wine. He looked at the assembled guests, the pastor, the banker, the foreman, and smiled the smile of a man who believes he has already won. "Tonight," Harold announced, his voice swelling with theatrical gravity, "marks a new chapter. I am officially naming Evan as CEO of Pratt & Sons." He paused for applause, which came readily, though I noticed the foreman's clap was slow, hesitant. Harold continued, "And to secure our legacy, Evan and I are finalizing a strategic partnership with a capital firm in Chicago. It's a necessary sacrifice to keep the Pratt name on the trucks, but it will make us bigger than we've ever been." A strategic partnership. That was the code. It was the sanitized corporate phrase for the asset-stripping sale I had seen in the distressed file. They were selling the company's soul to save the name. Evan beamed, raising his glass like it was a coronation, soaking in the adoration of a room he was about to betray. I did not clap. I picked up my water glass and set it down on the wood table hard. The sound was sharp, a gunshot of crystal against oak that sliced clean through the applause. The room fell into a confused silence. I stood up. My legs felt like jelly, but my voice was steady, cold, and unrecognizable to my own ears. "Are you sure you want to tell this story in front of everyone, Dad?" Harold's jaw tightened. The benevolence vanished, replaced by the sneer I knew so well. "Sit down, Deliah," he hissed, his eyes narrowing. "Don't you dare threaten your brother's moment. We'll discuss your jealousy later." "It's not jealousy," I said. I reached into my bag, pulled out the manila folder, and tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid across the lace runner and stopped right in front of Evan's plate. "It's math." "What is this?" Evan asked, his voice cracking. "Read it," I commanded. Then I looked at the guests, addressing them with the slow, measured cadence of an executioner. "Over the past 3 months, I have been purchasing Class B voting shares from founding stakeholders who felt abandoned by this family. I bought out Frankie, I bought out Mrs. Dalton, and as of last night, I bought out Ray McConnell." Harold's face went white. "Ray, you spoke to that traitor. The LLCs listed in those documents lead back to me." I continued, ignoring him. "As of today, I hold controlling interest in Pratt & Sons. You didn't just underestimate me, Dad. You forgot that Grandpa built this company with the town, not just for you. You can't erase them, and you don't get to erase me. As of this moment, I decide whether this company gets sold." A gasp rippled through the room. Someone dropped a fork. It clattered loudly against a china plate. Evan looked like he had been punched in the gut, his hustle culture confidence draining away to reveal the scared child underneath. Harold exploded. He slammed his fist onto the table, shaking the wine glasses. "You traitor!" he screamed, the veins in his neck bulging. "You stole my life's work, you ungrateful thief." "I didn't steal it," I said, my voice rising just enough to cut over his shouting. "I bought it. The same way those outsiders were going to, except I'm not gutting it. I'm stopping you from doing that." I turned to the banker and the foreman. "The pending sale is canceled effective immediately. A new CEO, a specialist in operations I've vetted, will be appointed on Monday. I will be serving as chair of the board to ensure no jobs are cut and the debt is restructured ethically." I looked back at Harold. He was trembling, stripped of his power in front of the very audience he had gathered to worship him. "You tried to strip me of my voice, my future, and my place at this table," I said, finality. "Tonight I stripped you of the right to ruin what Grandpa and this town built." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Harold stared at me, his eyes full of a hate so pure it felt toxic. "If you do this," he whispered, his voice shaking with rage, "you are no daughter of mine." The words landed like physical blows. I felt the grief wash over me, but it was old grief, a pain I had lived with for years. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see a giant. I saw a small, bitter man. "You already made that choice when you tried to erase me," I replied quietly. I turned and walked out of the dining room. Behind me, voices erupted, half fury, half stunned shock, but I didn't look back. The air outside had never tasted so clean. The gossip moved through Oakhaven faster than fiber optics. By the next morning, the narrative had already been poured, set, and hardened. Deliah Pratt was the ungrateful daughter who had stolen the family business and betrayed her own blood. I felt the eyes on me everywhere I went. At the gas station, conversation died the moment I walked in. At the diner, the waitress slammed my coffee down with enough force to spill it. When I came out to my rental car, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper, scrawled on a torn piece of notebook paper. "Go back to the city before you ruin us." It stung, a sharp physical prick of rejection, but I refused to flinch. I had spent my whole life being afraid of their judgment. I wasn't going to let it stop me now. I crumpled the note, tossed it in the trash, and drove straight to the yard. It was 600 a.m. I called an all-hands meeting on the shop floor. The air was thick with diesel fumes and hostility. 50 men stood with their arms crossed, looking at me like I was an infection. They were loyal to the name on the truck, not the woman standing in front of it. I didn't try to charm them. I turned on a projector I had set up on a workbench and threw the numbers onto the concrete wall. "This is the reality," I said, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. I walked them through the tax defaults, the ballooning debt, and finally the terms of the sale Harold had tried to hide. I showed them the clause about liquidation of non-essential assets, which was corporate speak for selling the land and firing the fleet. "If I had stayed quiet, you would have been the sacrifice," I told them, meeting their glares. "They were going to strip this place for parts and erase every one of you who kept it alive. I refused to let that happen." There was silence. Then the grizzled foreman, a man who had worked for Grandpa Earl since the '80s, stepped forward. He squinted at the projection. "Those sale documents. That true?" When I showed him the signatures from the Chicago firm, his shoulders slumped. The anger in the room didn't vanish, but it shifted. It went from hostility to a grudging, uneasy respect. The hardest confrontation wasn't with the workers. It was with Evan. He showed up at my motel room 3 nights later, drunk and weeping. He pounded on the door until I opened it. "You didn't just strip me of a job, Deliah," he slurred, bracing himself against the doorframe. "You stripped me of who I am. I was supposed to be the CEO." I looked at him, my little brother, who had been fed a steady diet of unearned praise until it choked him. "Dad built your identity on a lie, Evan," I said, my voice steady but sad. "I just took away the crown he never paid for." I told him to get therapy, to get sober, and to build something that was actually his. It was cold, but it was the first honest thing anyone had said to him in 20 years. He left without a word, disappearing into the dark. Vindication came slowly, not in a flood, but in a trickle. Over the next 6 months, the new CEO I appointed streamlined operations. Overtime abuse ended. Paychecks arrived on time. A small local news story ran with the headline, "Pratt & Sons turns around without abandoning roots." The mood in town thawed. The same people who had glared at me started nodding when I entered the diner. One afternoon, a worker's wife stopped me in the grocery store and quietly thanked me for saving her husband's pension. Even my parents, in their own broken way, began to shift. Harold attended a board meeting in the fall. He sat in the back row, looking aged and smaller than I remembered. Afterward, he muttered a clumsy, half-hearted apology about underestimating the situation. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a surrender. A week later, a package arrived from my mother. Inside was a box of old photos, pictures of me winning the science fair, me helping in the yard, images I thought had been thrown away. There was a note. "We were wrong not to see you. I'm sorry." 1 year later, the story circled back to another Thanksgiving. But this time, I wasn't driving to the farmhouse. I was in my apartment in Dallas. The table was a chaotic mess of mismatched chairs and store-bought pies. The guests weren't local dignitaries, they were my chosen family. Marissa and Tanya were there, arguing over wine. 2 of the longtime workers from Oak Haven had driven down. My aunt, the one who had quietly supported me, was laughing in the kitchen. And next to me was my boyfriend, a paramedic with calloused hands and a kindness that grounded me. The room was loud, unfiltered, and alive. I stepped onto the balcony for a moment of air, looking out over the city lights. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who begged for a seat at a table where she wasn't wanted. I realized that revenge wouldn't have sustained me. Revenge is a fire that burns you out. What sustained me was justice. I had reframed my coup not as an act of destruction, but as a refusal to disappear. I had chosen to protect others, even if it meant walking away from the role of the good daughter. I went back inside. Someone raised a glass. "To Delia," they shouted, "for saving a whole damn town." I smiled. It wasn't the polite smile of a ghost. It was the smile of a woman who had claimed her own story. "My name is Deliah Pratt. They tried to erase me. They tried to strip me of my future. Instead, I stripped them of the power to decide who I'm allowed to be." If you are listening to this and you're sitting at a table where they're trying to write you out of the will or out of the story or out of your own life, remember this: you don't have to stay seated. You can flip the table. And that brings us to the end of Delilah's journey, proving that sometimes the only way to be heard is to build your own table. If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, please hit that like button and subscribe for more. What would you have done in her position? Let us know down below. We read every single one of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.